So delighted to be here at CDCon. This is the first time I have done a keynote, not my first keynote, the first time it has been in person and virtual at the same time. So welcome to all of you who made it to Austin in this 102-degree weather. And hello also to those of you who are joining us virtually at home. I will try to remember that you are there as well for the kind of audience participation part of my talk. And some of you are looking at me like, audience participation, what? So today I'm talking about software delivery and developer experience in the age of platform engineering. All of those words should be somewhat familiar to you. And a little bit about myself. I am a senior analyst at RedMonk, which is a developer-focused industry analyst firm. If you've never heard of industry analysts before, my job is basically to follow tech trends. And I am very interested in what people are building, how they are building it, and what they are building it with. And also, we very much see the world through the eyes of developers specifically and technical practitioners more broadly. And while developer-led adoption is now something that the tech industry has kind of like increasingly acknowledged, my colleague Steve O'Grady wrote a book about that in 2013, which feels like 100 years ago. A little bit more about me so you kind of understand the perspective that I have and some of my biases. In another life, I was a tech writer. I love documentation. I will always, always, always kind of go for like documentation first among all other things. And if you missed Ember Stevens's lightning talk earlier today on technical documentation as a jigsaw puzzle, highly recommend that you catch the kind of replay. I've also worked as a test and release manager, meaning that I have used a plethora of CI/CD tools, and some of them have burned me very badly. I am jealous of the CI/CD tools that are out there today, because I feel like some of them would have made my life a lot easier back then, although I also feel like those also have the capacity to kind of burn you in some ways. And then also, I have been a university lecturer. So if you see me kind of pacing back and forth on the stage, it is from like a couple decades of walking around the classroom to see which of my students are falling asleep, which are not falling asleep, who looks confused, etc. You can find me on Twitter at Dr. KellyAnn Fitz, and if you get to my profile and see a picture of a dragon, that is in fact me, because talking about personal reinvention, in yet an earlier other life, I was a medievalist. And if there are any other medievalists at CDCon today, come find me. I will buy you 2 drinks. There's not that many of us out there. So in all of kind of my former lives, it's not always been about kind of me, right? As a tech writer, as a test and release manager, as a teacher, I find that it's always about who I am talking with. So I am very interested in you. So for those of you who are here, I'm going to ask you to do a show of hands. For those of you who are joining virtually, I have put on my Twitter profile, like pinned to my pinned tweet, a thread with a series of Twitter polls for these same questions. So feel free to answer them in that way or not. But for those of you who are here today, how many of you are familiar with software delivery? We started with an easy one, like hands up. All right, everyone, for those of you at home, everyone in the room had their hands up, which bodes very well for CDCon. Like I think we've got a good critical mass here. How about developer experience or DevX? A lot of hands as well, but I'm going to say perhaps a few less hands than for software delivery. And then finally, platform engineering. Again, a lot of hands, but probably the least popular answer for all the questions that I asked. So this also are the 3 things I will be talking about today. So here's also my agenda, which I made interactive somehow. Again, teacher. I won't spend too much on software delivery. I feel like the items I have here to talk about are more of reminders as opposed to anything new. But first and foremost, we are all consumers of software. I used about 9 different mobile apps to get to Austin. We all used a web app in order to register for the conference. We've probably all had the experience of our kind of video conferencing desktop client wanting to update itself 30 seconds before the very important conference call that you have. Right? So we're all familiar with this as consumers. Many of us are software producers. In fact, I would wager everybody in this room has in some way, shape, or form participated in the production of software here at CDCon. Developers are often both at once. They are using a whole bunch of software while producing software, and sometimes the same software is kind of on both sides of that, especially for companies that are big on, quote unquote, eating their own dog food or drinking their own champagne. And one thing that I will kind of put forth as perhaps a bit of a hypothesis is that advances in software delivery benefit developer experience on both sides of that. That the easier that we can make getting software out to people, the better it is for developers who are both consuming and producing that software. So moving on to developer experience and kind of why it matters, the experience of developing software and all the different things that kind of go into it. This is something that we're hearing more and more about, out there in the industry, especially from the business side of things, which has kind of taken up developer experience as something that is important, as a priority, for a number of reasons. First, this idea of velocity. Whereas a couple years ago, more conservative parts of an organization may have not wanted to move fast for fear of breaking things, whereas most developers I know are just like, let's get that stuff out there. Like, we can break whatever, we'll fix it, it'll be fine, everyone breaks the build. But as the kind of COVID pandemic has shown, the need to be able to adapt and to get things out faster has great advantages. And with the kind of introduction of the idea that moving fast also can produce better software, which the DORA report, the DevOps Research and Assessment kind of group has kind of put forward, there's been this like larger embrace of velocity, and it has almost become a business imperative where software is involved. Along with velocity comes this idea of developer productivity, how to make your developers as efficient as possible. And even though those first two might sound more like this is a business-driven type of thing, as a developer you might feel like you're somehow being like squeezed for as much work as you can possibly get out. Developer happiness is also a very important kind of concept out there. As Grace Francisco has already kind of talked about, the Great Resignation is real. So many people have left their jobs, and people in tech are also have been and are continuing to leave their jobs. Along with the Great Resignation, we're also seeing the Great Onboarding. People who are trying out new careers in tech, and developer experience can be essential in onboarding and training and get new developers kind of up to speed. Some people have argued that this is a golden age for developer experience because DevX is seen as a priority. Developer-led adoption is a thing, as I mentioned, and you can read Steve's book about it if you want more on that. But also things like self-service procurement. The fact that you can, with a credit card or not, because free trials are now much more abundant than they were, access almost any type of technology that you want without asking permission from IT or ops or whoever in an organization used to be that kind of gatekeeper of who got to use what. Also, there is an abundance of choice in frameworks and tooling, and Fatih showed us this earlier, but this is the continuous delivery foundation landscape, right? So think about the type of options that you have if you're trying to put together a CI/CD pipeline just from this map alone. And this, of course, does not include all of the options that are out there. However, software is not built by CI and CD or documentation alone. So perhaps you need not just CI and CD tooling, but a whole bunch of other different pieces in order to kind of build and test and deploy software, right? This is the CNCF landscape. And if you look at this and don't feel somewhat overwhelmed by the amount of options that you have for all the different kind of components and pieces, you have a much stronger stomach than I do. What we are seeing is that when developers are going to build something, they not only have to navigate this overabundance of choice, but then have to figure out how to make all of these pieces work together, and then have to figure out how to maintain all of those pieces working together in an industry where the second something is out there, the clock has started on when it is going to be obsolete or outdated. This is a phenomena that, again, my colleague Steve has kind of coined as the developer experience gap. So the time that developers who probably would rather just be writing code have to take away from that in order to maintain the often onerous chain of tooling that they need in order to do it, often with the technical equivalent of duct tape and baling wire. And I don't know about you, but in my past, I have done things with scripts that I am not proud of, And I assume that it caused absolutely no technical debt whatsoever. So what are people doing in order to attempt to address this developer experience gap? Integrations is probably the thing that we see as like the first attempt to figure out how to help people stitch these things together. Open standards is probably another kind of movement coming from maybe a different part of the community. The idea that if we're all building things according to some type of standard, maybe it will be easier to figure out what we're working with. Interoperability, which, yes, if things were actually designed to work together, it would be great. But interoperability often feels like the holy grail of kind of like software tool chains. It's this thing that we all think would be great, but we have no idea how to find it. And then finally, to today's topic, platforms. Now, the word platform is rather ubiquitous. This is a page from wordnik.com, which is kind of this wonderful not-for-profit site that goes through a whole bunch of different dictionaries to kind of pull together definitions. I have adopted the word platform for you, which you can do, meaning that you can actually check out platform on wordnik.com without looking at any ads. But as you can see, the word platform can refer to, say, the really cool shoes that I am wearing as I am standing on the physical platform that is the CDCon keynote stage, or the metaphorical platform by which I can convey my ideas out to you. We have political platforms. We have other types of physical platforms like train platforms or oil platforms. And then there's the way that we use the word platform in tech. And those are the shoes I would want to be wearing if it was not 102 degrees, by the way. So we've heard platforms used to talk about what in the past we would have talked about as products, right? We hear about data platforms, AI/ML platforms, observability platforms, DevOps platforms, and even conference platforms like the one many of you are watching me through right now. On the more specific kind of application development platforms, years ago we used to talk about platform as a service, PaaS, or PaaS, depending on how you pronounce it. I feel like we could start a fight if we, like a Jets and the Sharks type thing here, if we got into that. But while we don't usually use the word PaaS anymore, we are seeing a new generation of app development platforms out there that are prioritizing like developer experience. The Netlifys, the Gatsbys, the Vercels, the Renders. And then also we're seeing the rise of internal development platforms that are built in order to help optimize the developer experience for developers in an organization. Also, the concept of platform engineering, which all of you are familiar with, but has often been spoken of as this thing that is done at like FANG companies, is like absolutely becoming something that like companies of all kinds are talking about. And if you don't believe me, I refer you to Twitter, the town square of the internet, where we have people talking about platform engineering as the new DevOps or the new SRE, talking about what is the difference between platform engineering and ops, and then talking about what type of internal developer relations are needed for these internal platforms. And if you needed further proof that platform engineering is a thing, there is a conference for it now. The first Platform Con is happening online this week, I think led by a company called Humanitech. So why are internal platforms increasingly becoming a thing? In some ways, internal platforms allow organizations to leverage the expertise of people who are specifically focusing on how to put tools together, how to create something to build on, instead of having to do that as like a sidestep and then go and build the applications themselves, which I think is great. It's kind of like this acknowledges platform engineering as a skill, as a discipline. We should all think of it in that way, I think. Internal platforms also allow the creation of what have been called paved roads by Netflix or golden paths by Spotify. And I'll have a link to a Spotify blog that actually talks about golden paths and their relationship to Dune if you're really into sci-fi. And these golden paths or paved roads are these kind of like easy ways or approved ways or the kind of preferred ways of kind of navigating that giant landscape of developer tooling. It also creates venues for curating those tools, for kind of saying, here are the ones that we think you should use. It allows for insights into what people are using to build. And if you're security-minded, it's a way of putting guardrails around what your developers are doing so that it is not the wild, wild west of software development, which, as you all know, can have security implications in this day and age. And finally, it's a way of streamlining the delivery of the software needed to build software to users. And I want to talk a little bit about these users. And for that, I'm going to refer you to a talk that I saw a couple weeks ago at a conference called GlueCon by Lisa Kam of the New York Times. And this concept came from her, not from me. This is where I kind of learned it from. And she gave a talk on product managing your platform. And she talks about the application developers that she works for, the kind of platform team, and they actually have as their kind of users application developers and project managers and the like. And she refers to them as middle users, which I think is a really great term, with the end user being the people who are using the products and applications that are developed by the middle users. Now, this is her diagram. I'll give you a link to a set of slides that she's kind of made public. I wish there was a recording of her talk, but there isn't. And if I were to kind of take this and update it, which I did not do because I keep thinking about the different ways that I would update it for like a more general use case as opposed to what the New York Times is doing, I would probably throw in the pathways by which the platform teams are deciding what to use in the platforms that they are creating for their middle users, who are then kind of using that to like create apps for their end users. And I feel like we'd have this like great chain of being of users, which would be kind of great. So internal platforms, a lot to like about them, a lot of challenges in them, in building them, in creating them, in trying to get support for them. And first and foremost, that developer experience gap that I talked about earlier, in some ways, this does not solve that for the people who have to build the platforms, right? That we're just kind of like throwing down, we're like pushing the developer experience gap over to platform engineers. And while I'm not going to say that platform engineering experience gap is a term that we need to have, it's probably something that exists. Secondly, it can be very difficult to get organizational recognition for this type of internal work. Although I would say that the increase in like usage of platform engineering as a discipline or as a job title helps with this, right? Because it's not something that someone is doing like as their side project, right? And then also, it can be very difficult to figure out what the needs are of those middle users and the organization at large, especially in like larger organizations, places that have like 500 development teams. It can be very difficult to figure out what needs you are fulfilling in the platforms that you are building. And then finally, getting buy-in from middle users, which is why people are asking, do we need internal developer relations? So kind of in closing, I want to go back to that initial set of software delivery considerations that we kind of started with, and I want to amend it a little bit to say that when we're talking about developers as being both consumers and producers of software at once, I think middle users is like a really great term that we can actually maybe start working into our vocabulary when we think about who we are building for, why we are building, and what they are doing with the stuff that we are building. What are their end goals, right? And where they live on that kind of great chain of software users. Also, the idea of platform engineering and platform kind of teams as being the curators and enablers of software delivery. I think we need to start thinking about it that way. And finally, platforms, these internal platforms, very much need to be seen and treated as products, even if the end users are only internal. Because one of the ways that we improve the developer experience, and you may only ever use one of these platforms as a developer, is to empower platform teams and platform engineers, to help us out in that. Like, we get better developer experience from better software delivery, and if we can think of platform engineering in that mix, I think we're all going to have a much better experience in the way that we're building and delivering software. thank you very much for your time today. I have a list of all of the resources that I have used, and hopefully these slides will be published so you can just like click on the links instead of having to type out all of the different URLs. And I will be here until Thursday. I would love to hear what you are using to build your software. Thank you.